A few months ago I bought a PS5 and I started playing Demon's Souls on it for the first time. It's the only Fromsoft Soulslike that I haven't played before, and the thing that surprised me more than anything was how easy it was compared to previous games. The general impression I got while playing through all of them were that Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring were a bit easier, considering the variance in gameplay and the updates to the smooth combat systems. I had heard Demon's Souls was almost unfair in its traps and mechanics, which then got refined into Dark Souls, so the ease of it surprised me. Ahead of the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, there is no doubt it will be difficult, considering how many people have review bombed it on Steam based on not understanding the new levelling system. Thus, because I have nothing but contempt for myself, I decided to gather data on all of the Fromsoft bosses. This meant getting blind plays of all of the Soulslikes. This meant maybe 300 hours of watching different Fromsoft gameplay videos and recording individual data on a second-by-second basis. I recorded every hit, every death, and the times taken for all of these areas and bosses.
Yes, sirree. Thought about killing myself.
I did my best to find people fairly new to the games, as once you get a Fromsoft game, you generally understand the limitations of the combat and how to use it to your advantage.
Well, I finally dodged the Ichimonji.
The data will not be perfect, as you have different builds, people using summons, people using guides. But luckily, no matter what, it is difficult to fake skill, so hopefully the 3 separate blind runs would average to a decent pattern. There are some small things to consider when gathering the data though. Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 have sold over 20 million copies each, whereas Demon's Souls, even with the remake, has sold about 3 million copies, with most of them coming for the remake. So the player bases and odds on the new players picking them up are wildly different. It was very difficult to find Demon's Souls playthroughs from 2008. First, it might be useful to go through the online perception of all of the bosses. Essentially, which bosses in each game were considered the hardest, and which Fromsoft bosses in general were considered the most difficult. So I took 10 different online websites and polls, averaged their results, and gave the following results for each game. For Demon's Souls, the hardest boss was considered the Flame Lurker. Dark Souls, it was Ornstein and Smough. Dark Souls 2 was Fume Knight. Bloodborne was the Orphan of Kos. Dark Souls 3 was Dark Eater Midir. Sekiro was Ishin Sword Saint. And Elden Ring was Melania Blade of Miquella. And for overall in the Fromsoft series, 5th place was Sister Frieda. 4th place was Ludwig the Accursed. 3rd place was Melania Blade of Miquella. 2nd place, Orphan of Kos, and 1st place was Ishin Sword Saint. Let's go through each game in chronological order and see how the perception differs from the reality. Demon's Souls. The top 3 most difficult bosses by perception were the Flame Lurker, Man-Eaters, and Old King Allant. The big thing you have to understand about the bosses in Demon's Souls is that most of them actually have weird gimmicks or Zelda-style weaknesses. Take Tower Knight for example. It looks imposing, but once you know that you have to hit him in the ankles and he falls down and you can hit his head, the patterns are very predictable and you can reliably defeat them when you knock them over and hit their head. So these top 3 most difficult bosses from public perception seem to be the ones that do not have a gimmick and are just straight skill-based fights. Flame Lurker ranked as 3rd most difficult, with 12 deaths across 3 runs, which is 2 places down. Man-Eaters ranked 2nd, with 16 deaths, which matches the public perception. With 2 bosses to fight at the same time, this will become a pattern going forward. But the biggest problem with the Man-Eaters was that a lot of people seem to fall off the narrow bridge. Old King Allant was 4th place in data, with the same amount of deaths with 12 as the Flame Lurker. Not too far off, but surprisingly, the entry right at the top, with 41 deaths, is the Dragon God, a whole 9 places different. It mainly acts as a stealth boss to avoid its eye line. The problem is, you get one shot nearly all of the time while you're breaking debris to get around. I myself found this the most annoying boss by far, and it checks out. So while it's not exactly difficult because you understand how to beat it, it is definitely annoying and kills you the most because of how unforgiving the stealth is. The old monk also came in 5th place with 10 deaths, and this is a gimmick boss where it summons in another player to fight you, and this is just complete random. Most times it was just like 1 or 2 deaths, but someone just got stomped 8 times by pretty much 8 decent players. That's just something that can happen. Other notes I have, Phalanx and the Dirty Colossus had 0 deaths across all runs, quite easy and predictable fights with very slow moving bosses, and plenty of stage hazards to hide behind. The Penetrator is the biggest surprise, with just 1 death across 3 runs, down 9 places. While it's not the most complex fight, it's certainly a skill based fight towards the end of the game. It just seemed like most people attempted it right at the end when they were fairly strong and could just deal with it. One thing to note about Demon Souls is that it was the first game of these lot, which created a lot of these cliches of the fog gates and the boss rooms and the difficult combat, but as Yahtzee Croach will say, you used to just be able to roll behind them and stab them in the bum, which was a fairly reliable strategy. May have seemed difficult at the time. Compared to now, they are far less dynamic and far more predictable. In total, players of Demon Souls had 131 deaths to the bosses, with an average of 2.39 deaths per boss. Let's move on to Dark Souls. The top 3 bosses are obviously Ornstein Smough, the literal embodiment of Dark Souls difficulty.
It's unfortunate that I don't... What the fuck?
Which is top, with 107 deaths. Many of the players had to summon to deal with these fuckers as well, so in reality, the death count could be far higher. And Artorias of the Abyss in 2nd, with Manus, Father of the Abyss, in 3rd. These bosses are mainly around where you would expect them, with Artorias and Manus being 1 place lower than the Perception, each dealing 37 and 31 deaths respectively. But there is one boss that takes 2nd spot, and some may call it the first true goalpost in Dark Souls, and that is the Bell Gargoyles. 45 deaths from the Gargoyles. No gimmicks, it's a double up boss fight, which you'll see a lot of, and you also have the ability to fall off the stage, much like the Man-Eaters in Demon Souls. It's definitely a tough boss fight, and it's early in the game, and it shows players the standard of the bosses to come. Another boss that comes in 5th is Capra Demon with 30 deaths. While it's not exactly a difficult fight one-on-one, you get ganked immediately by 2 mob dog enemies, and the boss itself is fairly difficult at the same time. If you can overcome that quick burst of mob enemies, the actual fight is a bit of a cakewalk, but for new players, this is quite a difficult fight. Other standouts are the Asylum Demon, as it's the ultimate Dark Souls tutorial. It's not very hard at all, obviously, but when people do not understand what Dark Souls is about, there are plenty of deaths to be had, especially when you don't know you need to flee in the first part. One poor guy died 8 times to the Asylum Demon, just trying to beat it with the broken sword. Poor guy. Four Kings had a very high perception, but was down 14 places since they only had 9 deaths across the 3 runs, similar to Ravelord Nito having only 6 deaths across the runs while being down 11 spots. They are actually fairly full-on fights, but once you reach a certain level with decent equipment, it isn't that tough to tank your way through these fights, which seems to be the case in these runs. Bed of Chaos finished top for most deaths from falling, which makes complete sense. Also, funnily enough, someone died to Pinwheel, which people suspected would be the easiest boss in Dark Souls. It is clearly the easiest boss in Dark Souls, but the person basically went all the way there right from the start before going to Undead Burg, which is mad. So that's probably why the boss was actually at the right level for them to fight. And they did struggle slightly in the second battle. So it sort of makes sense for the boss to be easy since you can go there right away. But most people understandably are put off by the tough mob skeleton enemies. In total, players of Dark Souls had 495 deaths to the bosses, with an average of 5.91 deaths per boss. Now moving on to Dark Souls 2. In terms of mechanics, there are a few changes between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. The weapon options and magic uses are improved, with dual wielding being a much more useful option here, along with certain weapon arts being introduced. There is a mixture between Demon Souls and Dark Souls for the health options too, where you have your Estus flasks, but you also get the consumable life gems as well, which gives the prepared and patient players more advantages. Fume Knight is thought to have been the toughest boss in Dark Souls 2 according to the polls, with Dark Lurker following behind and Lud and Zalen following next. This is where I found a lot of the big surprises. First of all, Fume Knight gave 20 deaths over 3 runs, which put it as the 8th toughest boss. Dark Lurker and Lud and Zalen follow quite nicely with the 2nd and 3rd space spots, with 29 and 27 deaths respectively, both having aspects of being a multiple enemy boss. Haven't heard of those before. But taking the number 1 spot by quite a long distance with 81 deaths is the Royal Rat Authority. This is 19 places higher than the Perception, but this is probably the boss with the highest variance, since one run had 1 death in it, while another runner had 68 deaths. This is certainly the case where you can get mobbed by multiple rats that give you toxic before fighting the main boss. So if you're careful and fight the mob early, the main fight isn't tough at all, but it's certainly not the case for that one runner. It also was the boss with the most status deaths by far, even more than Metha, which you fight in a literal poison pool. On these types of deaths, you can break down deaths in a boss room into 3 categories that aren't just straight being shivved by the boss. Deaths by status effect, deaths by mob enemies, and deaths by falling. Dark Souls 2 tops the deaths by mob enemies with 50 and deaths by status effects with 12, along with being second for deaths from falling with 10. This means that a whopping 13% of the deaths to the bosses come from these other factors, more so than any other Fromsoftware game. Royal Rat Authority takes a big chunk of these for mob and poison, but also Duke's Dear Freya and Executioner's Chariot contribute a lot. Funnily, the 5th most difficult was the Old Dragon Slayer, which I always found easy as someone who beat Ornstein Snow in Dark Souls 1, but I suppose that's the difference with players playing Dark Souls 2 as their very first Soulslike. It killed players 22 times. A lot of the DLC bosses such as the Grave Robber Trio, Elana, Blue Smelter Demon and Burnt Ivory King were far easier than a Perception, being more than 10 places lower minimum, with only 7 deaths over 3 runs for the Burnt Ivory King. Must be noted that Lost Sinner and Executioner's Chariot didn't feature on any difficult list at all, and yet had 20 and 17 deaths respectively, putting them at 7th and 11th most difficult fights. Old Iron King and Duke's Dear Freya were also 10 spots higher than the Perception suggested. Seaman of Dong is the only boss which registered 0 deaths across all 3 runs, managing a meagre 3 hits. Yet, this game featured 41 different bosses, compared to the 26 of Dark Souls 1 and the 17 in Demon Souls, so that generally meant the average deaths per boss was lower at 3.76 per boss. Focusing on the fact that 18 of the bosses had an average of 3 deaths or less really contributed to this. In total, Dark Souls 2 had 534 deaths. Now moving on to Bloodborne. Bloodborne deals with a criticism the Souls series had until this point, where a lot of players felt forced into defensive builds and hid behind their shields more. So, the aggressive, fast-paced combat of Bloodborne was created. You can now gain health back if you hit enemies quickly after you're damaged. You do not have a shield, instead you have a firearm, which has a variety of different uses, and trick weapons, which change your playstyle and offensive options massively. The hardest perceived bosses are Orphan of Kos, Ludwig the Accursed, Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos, German the First Hunter, Lawrence the First Vicar. Orphan of Kos is by far the hardest with 225 deaths, followed by Lawrence the First Vicar with 132 deaths, Ludwig with 109 deaths, Ebrietas with 69 deaths, and in 5th place is Lady Maria with 53 deaths. Lawrence having the biggest bump of these by pushing up 3 places higher. But no German. He is sitting in 11th place, down 7 spots with only 17 deaths. While he's certainly a tough boss, I did notice a lot of people attempted the DLC before the boss, which may influence how strong someone is coming into the fight. But there are quite a few opportunities to parry German, which I did see exploited in the player runs. This boss fight is preceded by the biggest drop-off in spots with the Moon Presence, dropping 11 spots with a paltry 2 deaths. This puts the Moon Presence right at the bottom of all bosses in terms of difficulty. Even though it is straight after the Gurman boss fight, the difficulty of it mainly came from Gurman draining the health resources of the player beforehand. When the fight was retried, it was defeated first time, which shocked me. It's not all that difficult. The Moon Presence had even fewer deaths than the Witch of Hemwick, which had 3 deaths in 21st spot. Rom the Vacuous Spider finished top for deaths from mob enemies, which makes sense as they are the primary attackers. But one boss is up 10 places, and that is the One Reborn. This was pretty shocking to me, but it did come from one player dying 14 out of the 20 times from trying to do the drop attack like the Asylum Demon in Dark Souls. So this may be a bit of an outlier. Cleric Beast was higher by 7 spots than the Perception, but this seems to be the standard for the first bosses. They are a skill gate, and so new players will inevitably struggle with these, but looking back on the bosses, they are clearly not very difficult. Also, down 9 spots is Amygdala, with only 5 deaths. There's nothing more to report, it's just a big old boss that doesn't have much mobility. It's a bit like the One Reborn. Players didn't really have that much trouble with it, they just walk up to it and hit it. The Fromsoft DLCs are fondly known for being usually the best parts of the game, as well as sometimes the hardest parts. Of Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3, in their toughest 5 boss fights, each game has 2 bosses from their DLCs. Yet Bloodborne, they have 4 of their top 5 toughest bosses as DLC fights. The Souls games all have fairly decent portions of the overall boss deaths coming from the DLC as well. 19.5%, 23.4% and 31.2% respectively. But Bloodborne, the Old Hunters, has a monumental 63.1% of game deaths. In total, players of Bloodborne had 834 deaths to the bosses, with an average of 11.97 deaths per boss. Moving on to Dark Souls 3. Following on from Bloodborne's frenetic combat and incredible boss design, Dark Souls 3 went a bit crazy in its bosses, focusing heavily on 2-stage fights. For example, Udix Gundyr starts with the standard glaive fighter, and yet at half health changes into the massive abyssal serpent form. There is a real emphasis placed on the spectacle of these fights, the truly exciting part of a Soulslike. The top rated, most difficult boss fights for Dark Souls 3 were Dark Eater Midir, Slave Knight Gale, Sister Frieda, Nameless King, and Pontiff Sullivan. 4 out of these 5 are in the top 6, with each achieving 100 deaths over 3 runs. The most difficult boss by far in the data is the Nameless King with 421 deaths, fairly consistently killing players a lot, with 89 deaths being the fewest suffered at his hands by a player. But Dark Eater Midir finished 8th for the most deaths with 72, with one run only taking 7 to defeat the dragon. But Abyss Watchers and Soul of Cinder finished 3rd and 4th, with 254 deaths and 155 deaths respectively, pushing them up higher, with Abyss Watchers being another multi-person boss fight. An interesting thing to point out is that Sister Frieda had 3 different stages, with a multi-enemy stage in the middle. Sister Frieda is far more of an endurance fight than the Nameless King, for example. The Nameless King hits you an average of 4.5 times per death, while Sister Frieda hits you an average of 8.8 times per death. Also, if you look at the average seconds for an attempt between deaths, the Nameless King kills you an average 37.5 seconds, while Sister Frieda kills you on average every 60.1 seconds. This just shows the difficult nature of the Nameless King fight, as it comes from its incredibly powerful strikes that nearly take off all of your health, while Sister Frieda is a slugfest racking up 2,816 hits in 318 deaths. Osiros, Demon Prince and Dragon Slayer armor have all finished at least 6 places lower than the Perception, with Osiris having 13 deaths over 3 runs, while Dragon Slayer armor and Demon Prince having 38 and 42 deaths respectively. It's funny that Demon Prince and Dragon Slayer armor have finished 15th and 16th place for most deaths in Dark Souls 3, it would still stick them 2nd place for Dark Souls 2 and 3rd place for Dark Souls 1. Just showing how every boss is getting a pump up in difficulty. This is the first game I noticed the trimming of the runback. If you were fighting Ravelord Nito, you would have to rush through a bit of a gauntlet in the Tomb of the Giants before challenging the boss, which would then take nearly a minute and a half every time. This can add to the dread and the perception of the difficulty, whereas in Dark Souls 3 often you are plopped 10 to 20 seconds away from the fog gate with not many obstacles, which just feels far less frustrating when you get to a more difficult boss, since you don't have to spend much time between the fights to then repeat and learn the boss patterns. Rounding out the bottom 5, High Lord Wolnir, Yorm and Deacons of the Deep all are gimmick fights, and this makes sense. When you figure out the trick to killing them, they are very easy to defeat. Crystal Sage is the only normal boss fight, but the health pool is very low, which makes it a fairly quick fight if you just rush them. In total, the players of Dark Souls 3 had 2,100 deaths to the bosses, with an average of 27.5 deaths per boss. Moving on to Sekiro. Sekiro takes the combat system to a new level. No longer can builds and different weapon types, along with hiding behind a shield, help the player in these fights. You must parry, attack, and use your prosthetics at the right time. You cannot hide in this game. I do notice the whole Get Good squad love beating bosses with a soup ladle and their underpants, but often there is a decent build behind it. In Sekiro, it's purely down to skill. The upgrades basically giving you a few more options, but if your fundamentals are off, you're toast. Generally speaking, this is the game where there is the highest alignment with the perceived difficulty and the data. Ishin's Sword Saint and Demon of Hatred perfectly line up with the data, 355 and 259 deaths respectively. Ishin is a 3-stage complete test of your mastery of the mechanics, while Demon of Hatred is a pure endurance against a massive health pool enemy that is extremely difficult to parry. The surprises are that up 6 spots we have Lady Butterfly, who came 4th in the data with 161 deaths, and Genichiro in 3rd place up 4 spots with 193 deaths. Lady Butterfly is essentially one of the first bosses and a tough enemy that demands you get familiar with the parrying system. In a lot of these games there tends to be an early game boss who acts as a skill barrier, probably not the most difficult upon replaying, but it really tests the player at the time. Bell Gargoyles and Old Dragon Slayer fit this mould, and now Genichiro does as well. Guardian Ape came 5th, 3 places higher than the Perception with 144 deaths, and I certainly believe this is because of the change in styles. Previous bosses can have a mixture of being pressured by your attacks along with parrying their attacks when learning them, whereas the Guardian Ape has a big health pool and is very difficult to parry, so it's relying purely on you dodging and then attacking. This, along with the fake out death, make it an endurance fight. This is the longest of the fights that aren't gimmicks, with it just being under 3 minutes per death on average. Owl Father is ranked at 6th most difficult, where the Perception was 3rd. It's down 3 places. One thing to note here is that the actual Perception data was extremely close for the top 8 bosses, and the bosses from 4th to 6th place in deaths all had over 120 deaths each. It is a tough fight, but one at the end of the game where you're more familiar with the gameplay style, and it's not one of the truly difficult final fights. Folding Screen Monkeys and Divine Dragon are basically gimmick puzzle bosses with 1 and 3 deaths each respectively, and that 1 death for the monkeys came from falling out of stage. In total, players of Sekiro had 1,423 deaths to the bosses with an average of 36.5 deaths per boss. And the final game, Elden Ring. I will not be talking about the DLC here, with a lot of very, very tough bosses in there, but we will focus on the base game. First things first, Elden Ring base game contains 175 bosses, which is far more than the next highest of 41 in Dark Souls 2. Along with this, the mechanic of spirit summons became quite well used, and a useful item during the game, along with the Stakes of Marika sticking the player right outside the boss's door. So this means the player has more tools and a quicker restart to take on all of the bosses. And also, the game is an open world Souls-like. So, you can take on a lot of bosses in any order you want to give you more equipment and runes before fighting the more tough, mandatory remembrance bosses. But they have slapped up the abilities of the bosses, and they all have very varied movesets to make them far more dynamic. This is especially clear in the remembrance bosses, as they have two forms based on their health bar. So, the most difficult bosses based on the audience perception are Melania, Blade of Mikola, Radagon of the Golden Order, Malekith the Black Blade, Godskin Duo, and Dragonlord Placidusax. It is fairly clear that Melania is the toughest boss by quite a way. 905 deaths across 3 runs. The next nearest was Moog, Lord of Blood, with 186 deaths, up 4 places. The AoE spells and the mid-fight healing really played a part in the difficulty. It hits hard, it moves quick, and it has the ability to deal with multiple players, and so spirit summons are in danger. Radagon came 3rd, down 1 place with 149 deaths, but this may actually genuinely change, since the DLC gives you the ability to summon Torrent against the Elden Beast, which might make the fight much more manageable. Malekith is down 4 places, in 7th with 90 deaths, mainly coming from the second form flipping around. Godskin Duo is down 6 places, with 71 deaths. Another multi-person boss fight, yet if you have a spirit summon, it becomes incredibly much more manageable if you just defeat one of the bosses early. You can then flip between fighting one boss at a time. Placidusax is down 32 spots. Complete madness. Only 6 deaths across 3 runs. I personally found Placidusax quite easy. Another get right up inside them and stab them, which also seems to be the case. Starscourge Radahn is also higher up with 3 places, probably due to the whole gimmick is that you actually summon people anyway for the fight, so the AoE and large hitboxes make him a handful. It also doesn't help that some people played after the initial patch, which made him a little bit easier. In 5th place, up 17 spots, is the initial tree sentinel in Limgrave. Clearly a tough enemy, meant to encourage you to understand that some bosses are tough and need to be tackled later when you're stronger. But it still led to 130 deaths, mainly due to one runner throwing themselves at the sentinel to get an early win, with others returning later and killing them in roughly 3 to 5 deaths. You see that a lot with a lot of these other bosses in Elden Ring. If they're too tough to start, you'll just come back later when you're absolutely overpowered and kick the shit out of them. Margit and Godric are fairly high up 8 places each, which does make sense as they're clearly both the first skill barrier bosses, Margit being the first mandatory boss and Godric being the second. Both come early into the game where players are very unlikely to have massively leveled up and built a crazy moveset. The 3 other bosses I want to mention are the Red Wolf of Radagon, even though they have 66 deaths, purely came from one runner really struggling against magic and dying 61 times. However, 2 fighters in the Everjails do stand out. The first Crucible Knight on Storm Hill, and Alecto, Black Knight Ringleader, in Liurnia. Both have 71 and 62 deaths respectively, and it's clear they are incredibly tough, since you cannot use spirit summons in an Everjail. Crucible Knight is just a very tough early boss with high health and powerful attacks, while Alecto is an incredibly powerful enemy generally. One of the most difficult boss fights for me personally was probably Alecto. It has a wide range of moves, it's quick and agile, and it deals heavy damage. The first Crucible Knight wasn't in any of these difficulty lists, preferring to list Crucible Knight or Dovis, which is a duo fight again, which could be tougher, but if you use spirit summons in this fight, it's far more manageable. And since you probably have better equipment by this time, it comes with only 13 deaths across 3 runs, which was down 20 spots. The bosses which were down 30 spots each were the aforementioned Placidusax and also Morgott, Omen King, along with Godfrey, first Elden Lord. Both of these 2 had 4 and 5 deaths, respectively over 3 runs. I found that these fights at the end became quite easy with over 120 levels in your character and the powered up weapons and spirit summons. You ended up absolutely mowing down most bosses. It's only specific bosses at the endgame, which, regardless of all builds, seem to have the power to kill players anyway. Looking at the easiest boss fights in this game, it's quite difficult, as of the 175 bosses, 82 of them were beaten in the first attempt. It's the nature of the game that you'll come back to some areas you may have found quite tough, with much more powerful weapons and spirit summons, and you'll just completely stomp these areas. So it is difficult to rank the overall easiest boss fights, but what I did for the ones with 0 deaths is noted the time to defeat them as the only differentiating factor. So Beastman of Pharaoh Mazula being easiest with 19 seconds. Red Wolf of the Champion is surprising, as that's a fairly late optional boss as well, and yet it just makes sense because a couple of people didn't really struggle with Red Wolf of Radagon either. Mimic tier being the least difficult main boss makes sense, as they are a gimmick boss. You fight yourself, and there's the obvious tactic of taking off all your armor and weapons before putting them back on to kick the fuck out of them. Going with the idea that Elden Ring throws a lot more manageable bosses to give the player a feeling of progress, and gives you more items and experience. This adjusts how you view the statistics of deaths in the game. If you count all 175 bosses, then it's 7.9 deaths per boss. If you only count the mandatory and remembrance bosses, which equates to 31 of them, this jumps to 68.48 deaths per boss. So let's look at Fromsoftware in general. Obviously, we must first mention Melania. It's fairly obvious that this boss had 905 deaths alone, which made them more than double the next nearest difficult boss with Nameless King on 421. Well, rewatching the footage, her attacks take roughly a quarter to a half of the player's health off per attack. She hits the player on average 6 times per death, and she has 13 separate move types. You could maybe say that the Phase 2 variants of the moves in Phase 1 are updated with the Aeonia Geysers as well. On top of this vast moveset, it is quite dynamic, and she is aggressive, with some moves being quick and long ranged, some being grabs, some tails being fairly similar with slightly different timings on the attacks. Essentially, lots of moves to deal with lots of different builds. On top of this, to counter defensive players, every hit heals her for a small percentage. Then, in the second phase, it gets worse, with AoE attacks, extremely long range combos, and the fact that every one of her moves inflicts Scarlet Rot. Even if you wanted to parry her, you have to do it 3 times in a row for it to come off. Finally, to finish this off, she maybe has one of the most difficult to avoid attacks in every game I've ever played, the Waterfowl Dance. It lasts for about 6 seconds with an extremely wide range and distance. Will probably drain all of your health regardless of how much defense and vigor you have, and the methods to dodge it are very precise. So most likely if you're close to her and she winds this up, you're toast. Yeah, she's hard by every metric. The other bosses have their own difficult aspects. Nameless King has more HP than the Soul of Cinder, and yet by far the most deadly attacks of the top 5 at 4.5 hits per death, compared to Soul of Cinder's 9.6 hits per death. Some of the Nameless King's attacks can take 3/4 to all of your health bar if you're not careful. As is the case with each of these bosses in the top 5, they have a dynamic and varied moveset which can deal with multiple builds as well as being very aggressive, with 7 moves in Phase 1 and 9 in Phase 2. Sister Frida has nearly 19,000 HP, almost double of Soul of Cinder, 3,000 more than Dark Eater Midir. She has invisibility in the first phase with 7 move types. She gains another fighter in Phase 2, and in Phase 3 has AoE and projectile attacks with more damage from the Black Flame. Just an overall nightmare of a fight, clocking in at 3 minutes per death. This is an endurance test, the longest of the top 5, which just wears most players down. Ishin Sword Saint has 4 phases, Christ. First as Genichiro, then Ishin with a katana, then adding a spear and pistol to his arsenal, before adding lightning to his moves in Phase 3. Due to the nature of Sekiro, this is a pure test of your compatibility. There's nowhere to hide. You have to parry well, you have to counter dangerous moves, and you have to keep the pressure on. Even though Ishin has only 12 moves, he covers all playstyles. There's 9.6 hits per death, and also the second longest with 2 minutes and 32 seconds per death. Demon of Hatred has 3 death blows without many opportunities to parry. This is a fight where you will drain the health before filling the stagger bar. Has 9 moves, many unblockable in Phase 1, an extra in Phase 2, and also creates a Ring of Fire in Phase 3 with 2 extra moves. There are a variety of AoE and ranged attacks which cover all of the bases as usual. This boss takes 2 minutes 33 seconds per death and 7.5 hits per death. It's on the other end of the scale for Sekiro bosses from Ishin. Similar to how I compared Genichiro and Guardian Ape earlier, Demon of Hatred is the pinnacle test for aggressive attacks and precise dodging in a gauntlet of pain. I must mention Orphan of Kos in 6th place. Extremely difficult, 11 moves, has aggression and variety while nearly double the health pool of Gurman. Everything we said about the other bosses from a gameplay perspective, without many gimmicks here. Average of 2 minutes and 5 seconds per death, 7.9 hits per death. It's overall just an extremely tough fight. Humorously, on the Fextra Life page in the guides on how to beat Orphan of Kos, it includes a note to just pray. The big point to be made here is that clearly the deaths are increasing constantly in these games. We start with 2.39 deaths per boss in Demon's Souls, and it continually increases up to Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 at the top. So those bosses in those later games will feature more on these lists purely due to that fact. The top 5 most difficult rated Fromsoftware bosses are Ishin Sword Saint in 1st, Orphan of Kos in 2nd, Melania Blade of Miquella in 3rd, Ludwig the Accursed in 4th, and Sister Frieda in 5th. Other bosses that had over 100 deaths were Moog, Radagon, Radahn, Limgrave, Tree Sentinel, Margit, Soul of Cinder, Slave Knight Gale, Abyss Watchers, Lady Butterfly, Guardian Ape, Genichiro, Owlfather, Lawrence the First Vicar, and Ornstein and Smo. When you take the biggest change from perception, that will be Moog, with 30 places higher. I'm shocked by this, as it sort of made a point before the DLC for Shadow of the Erdtree that only 30% of players had beaten Moog in the base game of Elden Ring. Soul of Cinder also was 28 places higher, and Lorien and Lothric were 25 places higher as well. But this is all based on how much you die in the boss room. The problem is that some people have different memories of the experience, as I mentioned before. You can die 100 times to Slave Knight Gale, but when you respawn right outside the room, it's far less frustrating, and a lot of the deaths meld into one. Whereas when you die to Ornstein Smo, you have to walk back from the cathedral bonfire through Silver Knights, jumping over rails, avoiding Royal Sentinels, just to make it back for one more try. I believe this accounts for a lot of people's perception. You see that in Dark Souls 1, 75% of all deaths occurred on the way to the actual bosses. Specifically, Anor Londo and Blighttown being absolute nightmares. You cannot teleport at the start of Dark Souls, so it probably leaves a taste of frustration in people's mouths for the most notorious boss runs. But as the years go on, you find fewer and fewer deaths come outside the boss battles. This is backed up by the fact that the bosses take fewer and fewer hits to kill the player, dropping from 12.76 hits in Dark Souls 1 down to 8.06 hits in Elden Ring. This is evidence for my claim that bosses are made more difficult, since the frustration between getting to the bosses is removed. Therefore, people associate bosses from the older games as being more difficult, whereas in reality, it takes far more skill for the average player to beat some of the harder bosses in Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3. A lot of bosses not in Sekiro, Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 drop a bunch of places from their perception purely because they have fewer deaths than these seemingly harder games. But one boss does stick out, and that is Dark Eater Midir, a secret boss in Dark Souls 3's DLC. It is down 14 spots to the 20th toughest boss, with 48 deaths. It's still respectable, but the main difficulty does seem to come from the large health pool of the boss, which is indeed an endurance run. But it has fairly predictable moves, and it means anyone who has accumulated a strong enough build by this point, at the very end of the game, will not have much trouble. Ludwig drops out of top 5, down 12 places to 16th, while Lawrence the First Vicar jumps up 9 spots to take 14th for the Bloodborne bosses, with Lawrence's high health pool being the bigger reason for the difficulty, being nearly double the time you spend on the boss, from 4 hours 57 minutes and 2 seconds for Ludwig to 8 hours 5 minutes and 14 seconds for Lawrence over 3 runs. There are 4 bosses over 100 deaths that didn't feature on any toughest boss list, which I find interesting. Limgrave Tree Sentinel on 130 and Lady Butterfly on 142. I do understand this since they are essentially first bosses of the game and serve well as tutorials or gateways. and so people's perception never usually comes back to those early ones. Whereas Pontiff Sulivan is a clear mid-game boss and a very tough obstacle, 129 deaths, and it caused plenty of trouble. While Abyss Watchers came 6th with 254 deaths, a tough battle and has multiple enemies fairly early in the game. Abyss Watchers, they're the only non-endgame boss included here. Basically they use a lot of Artorias' moveset with the Flame Edition for more AoE and projectile attacks. They only have 8 move types in the second form, though the first form does have a multi-person boss fight, even if one of those bosses can actually help you. There are no outliers with this boss, each player died a lot to them, an average of 6.4 hits per death, so the second most deadly, but at 1 minute and 18 seconds per death, it's the most aggressive boss fight out of the top 6. And coming in at the 4th or 5th boss in the game, this is just an outlier for the difficulty curve. Generally, in a lot of these lists, people leave off the early game bosses. It's probably looking back at them at the end of the game, they are much more manageable than some of these very tough bosses. But that isn't really the point of a difficulty curve. Yet, if you look at the actual curve of a lot of these bosses, in Demon Souls there is a fairly neat line, Dragon God being the only outlier. Dark Souls 1 has a decent difficulty curve with fairly similar bosses until a big skill gate in Ornstein Smough, before the game reverts back to the previous curve, with a slight increase in the DLC. Dark Souls 2 looks consistent, but once you remove Royal Rat Authority, since it basically stumped one player, the curve just bounces around all over the place for each boss. Bloodborne is fairly consistent until you reach the DLC, and then damn. Dark Souls 3 is almost a mixture, so it has a consistent curve until a midway gateway of Abyss Watchers, and then the final and secret bosses have a big spike, followed by a difficult DLC. Sekiro follows a pattern which shows it is difficult at the beginning, probably when you master the combat, and then the middle gets much easier, before jumping right back up to Ishin and Demon of Hatred at the end. Elden Ring is a bit all over the place, due to the nature of it being an open world game, which can skew the deaths for a lot of the bosses. And you must consider how much of an outlier Malenia is. But if you take just the Remembrance bosses without Malenia, you can see a decent pattern, similar to Sekiro, showing the earlier bosses of Margit, Godric and Radahn act as more gateway bosses. Then, when you get towards the end, from Farum Azula and the optional areas onwards, the deaths spike back up. I had a look at the bosses with the most and fewest hits on the player per death, as either end of the scale may become annoying. If a boss has loads of hits on a player per death, it implies that they're quite weak and just do lots of small annoying attacks, whereas if they kill you in very few moves, it means that they're quite cheap in the fact that they just hit you once or twice and it drains all of your health. The Deacons of the Deep have the average of 28.5 hits on a player per death, and you can also count Phalanx and Dirty Colossus with 33 hits each, but I didn't record any deaths each for these bosses. On the other end of the scale, the boss which kills you in the fewest hits has to be Ancient Dragon from Dark Souls 2, with 1.44 hits per death. This makes sense, it's ranked as a difficult boss, but it has a Flame Breath AoE attack, which is the only reason people seem to think the fight is difficult, since it basically kills you in one. One more thing to consider, sure the game may look hard, but if one boss gives you 1000 deaths and is responsible for 90% of all of the game's deaths, then the game seems to be quite easy overall until you hit that one spike. So I looked at the percentage of fights that had over 10 deaths in the game. Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2 being quite poor for 5.9% and 4.9% respectively, whereas Dark Souls 3 provides a decent challenge in most of the boss fights at 76%. This massively changes for Elden Ring, with a big increase to 171 boss fights in an open world, but for the main Remembrance and mandatory bosses, this is still quite respectable at 40%. This definitely backs up the point that Fromsoftware are focused on making more and more dynamic and difficult boss fights. Finally, it's also interesting to see how long a boss fight takes on average per death, which means how long you actually spend in the battle. The average fight of all games is 80.9 seconds, or 1 minute and 20.9 seconds. The fights with the lowest average time are Giant Lord, Pontiff Sulivan, Ornstein Smough, Old Demon King and Dragon God, 2 of these are from Dark Souls 3, with most of them being fairly difficult rushdown fights, while Ornstein Smough functions the same way from Dark Souls 1. Giant Lord has explosive projectiles right at the start which can kill you instantly, so if you avoid those, the player usually wins, which explains the very short death time. Dragon God is the interesting one here, as technically it's a gimmick boss which revolves around stealth, and so you would imagine this would be a long fight, but the sheer amount of deaths at the first rubble barrier bring this fight time down quite massively, with some of the later deaths lasting more than 2 to 3 minutes each once you get through that first rubble barrier. The bosses with the longest times per death are Regal Ancestor Spirit, Seaman of Dong, Tower Knight, Phalanx, and Folding Screen Monkeys, which came top with 3,214 seconds, or 53 minutes and 34 seconds over 3 runs. This makes sense as it's a gimmick fight, where you search an arena to find the actual bosses before killing them. Phalanx and Tower Knight are slow, ponderous fights where you circle around to get the best hit, or you avoid slow, predictable attacks before knocking it over and hitting on its head. Seaman of Dong and Regal Ancestor Spirit seem to be more slow fights because the boss becomes unhittable for a chunk of their attack. Not many deaths occurred, just slow fights. In conclusion, what can we take from this? Well, it seems that in spite of what I personally perceived, Fromsoftware games seem to be getting tougher and tougher, at least from the perspective of their boss fights. Malenia is easily the toughest boss fight out there, accounting for 34% of Elden Ring's total deaths. And the boss runbacks have decreased significantly over time, which may result in the perception of easier games, even when they statistically aren't. There is no reason to suggest Fromsoftware will stop making bosses more dynamic and difficult, even with the more refined tools you're given to deal with them. Judging by how mean Miyazaki was with Malenia, we're going to have some real difficulties in the DLC. Praise the sun.